Hi everyone, welcome to my very second official podcast, or I guess this is a Facebook Live recording. So my name is Eric Rodebois. I am the owner of EPGD Business Law, and we are going to cover something that is truly a complicated subject, so I'll try and keep it short and to the point. I've actually taught a number of classes on this, and it's a question I probably get more than any other from my business and corporate clients, which is, what does it mean to pierce the corporate veil? Actually, to tell you the truth, that's not what they usually ask. What they usually ask is, how do I make sure that my assets are protected from my business? So I think this is really one of my favorite drawings. I use the board for this one at least once a day. In fact, what we should have done is we should have recorded the conversation I had with a potential client today around noon, where I literally did this. So I'll change the names to protect the innocent, but check this out. Let's say we got Bob. And in Bob's case, and this is really common for South Florida, Bob has, well, let's say 3 properties. When I do properties, I like to make them look like little houses. So Bob is the owner of 3 properties. Each of these 3 properties are income producing. None of them are homestead. He's not living in any of them. In fact, every month he gets a rent check, little money goes up, and then he pays out taxes, insurance, whatever, maintenance fees, management company, whatever it is, and at the end he has his net, right? And so that's his little profit from each of these. And so Bob comes to me and he says, how am I, what could happen, how am I protected, how am I not protected? And I explained to him pretty much that he is as unprotected in this situation as he could possibly be. In fact, if there's an accident in one of these properties, let's just say a slip and fall, or heaven forbid something worse, the lawsuit will be directly at Bob. The lawsuit will be from claimant down here. So here, let's erase the dollar signs. And actually now we've got lawsuit, okay? Lawsuit goes to Bob. And I always say, number 1, something bad has to happen. Number 2, they have to sue you. Number 3, your insurance doesn't cover it. And number 4, you lose. And so now number 5, where are we? We're in collections. So in this case, if Bob has a judgment against him personally, they can go after his other assets, which include the properties themselves, and potentially his bank account or other assets. We have 2 definitions of assets. That's not the purpose of this conversation, but we have exempt and non-exempt. So like a college saving plan for Bob's kids might be exempt. His homestead where he lives in Florida is exempt. But otherwise, Bob's going to lose all these houses, okay? In the worst case scenario. Remember, 5 things had to go wrong. And we'll just assume that all of them did. That's why lawyers are always pessimistic. We're always predicting that everything goes wrong, and no one wants to hear it until it really happens, and then they're happy that they had a good lawyer. Okay, so let's go back. We got Bob's 3 houses, and so Bob says, well, what can I do? And I say, well, listen, Bob, you're really running businesses. Each of these is an asset that generates income and has expenses and creates a net. So the first easiest thing for Bob to do would be to set up, and I just use LLCs as a simple example. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be a corporation. That's really not the purpose of this discussion. But let's just say that he sets up 3 LLCs. And obviously there's a cost for this, both initial and annual. Time and expense. He's gonna have to go to the bank. Ideally, he'll have 3 separate bank accounts. Each LLC will receive its own rent checks, it'll pay its own expenses. And then let's just say Bob is right here. So now Bob owns 3 LLCs. Okay, so let's again have the situation. The situation is something goes wrong, there's a lawsuit. Now the lawsuit is not against Bob, the lawsuit's gonna be against the LLC. Okay, we got lawsuit. I hope you can see it on the little camera. So lawsuit goes against the LLC. Remember, we got the 5 things that happened. Something went wrong, they decided to sue, didn't have enough insurance, they got a judgment, and now they're trying to collect. Okay, so in this case, the LLC is on the hook for whatever the amount of the judgment is. So we can safely assume that that property is gone. That property will be used to satisfy the judgment. So let's say, just for round numbers, the judgment's for $5 million, the property is only worth 1, so now the lawyers, and now what they're called is judgment creditors, the plaintiffs, are going to be trying to go after Bob and Bob's other assets to collect on that debt. Okay, so I'm getting to the point. Right here, in this line of ownership between Bob and each of his LLCs is an imaginary line we call the corporate veil. It's what the LL stands for. the limited liability. So this corporate veil is the imaginary line. I like to actually call it a legal fiction. It is the mass hypnosis that we have all agreed to that Bob is somehow separate from his LLC that he paid $125 and created on Sunbiz. And as long as Bob follows certain rules, any judgments against this LLC cannot go up here. That is piercing the corporate veil. When the veil is pierced, Bob becomes liable for debts of his company. So just to go back a couple steps, when he has the lease with the tenant of this property, or when he enters into a business contract, he's not signing as Bob. He's signing as Bob's LLC, comma, manager Bob. Okay, and that's really important because that way the liability is here. And remember, we've all agreed that Bob is separate from his LLC as long as he follows those simple rules. So what are the simple rules? Number one, no fraud. Okay, Bob can't use his LLC to create mischief and to try and defraud other people. If he does that, frankly, if I'm the lawyer, I say, Your Honor, seriously, you can't let Bob use Sunbiz to defraud my client. Okay? And frankly, judge will probably agree. Number two, alter ego. I think I'm misspelling that. Alter ego. Anyways, the point is that Bob needs to keep a separate bank account from himself and his LLC. I once was successful in piercing the corporate veil. We had this situation. We got a judgment against the LLC. In post-judgment discovery, I requested all of the bank statements of the LLC, and sure enough, the guy was going to Hooters, Massage Envy, the strip club, and Disneyland on the LLC's dime. Well, I can probably guarantee that those were not business expenses. I doubt that they were recorded accurately to the IRS. And my point to the judge was, listen, if Bob is allowed to use his LLC to no pun intended, pleasure himself, then I should be able to go after Bob for the LLC's debts. And sure enough, the judge agreed. So basically, I call this the separate bank account rule. And what Bob should have done is taken a proper distribution or salary, had the money go from the LLC's bank account to his personal bank account, reported it accurately to the IRS, and then whatever Bob decides to do on his free time is nobody's business. At least it's not mine. All right, so then the third thing is I call them the formalities. Okay? If you want the protection of a business, and that protection is this imaginary line, the LL, the limited liability. Let's just be clear. Limited liability as opposed to general liability. General liability means Bob's responsible for all the debts. That was the first picture. Limited liability means Bob is only responsible subject to how much he invested, his capital contribution to this LLC. I'll give you an example. If I buy shares in Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola has a humongous judgment and goes out of business, heaven forbid, then all I lose are those shares that I bought. They're not going to come after me, Eric investor, and go after my personal life, my personal bank accounts, my family, etc. That's the limited liability. And by the way, just so we're clear, it exists and was invented for corporations. So I've had the people come to me and they say, wait, no, limited liability is just for LLCs, not for corporations. And I'm like, no, you got that one confused. It was actually invented with corporations. In fact, fun fact, the Dutch East India Company was the world's first corporation, and it was just that. We pool our money, and all we risk if everything goes wrong is what we put into the company, which allowed me to have my other side of my life. Whereas, I'll give you the opposite example, a partnership. If my friend Patrick and I start a company and just do it as a simple partnership, if everything goes wrong, I'm not just going to lose my investment in the partnership, I'm going to lose my personal assets. And that goes back to that whole exempt, non-exempt, homestead, whatever that discussion. So what are the formalities? The formalities are running it like a business. So typically, a company should have a company book. In fact, for a corporation, it's a requirement. So this fancy book is called a minute book. And inside it, this is actually the one for my law firm. I keep it there for demonstrative purposes. A company should have, and this is an ancient thing, it's really funny in this electronic age, a company seal. Company seal is the thing where you put together and it makes the raised imprints on a piece of paper. Okay, that's the company seal. A company obviously is going to have articles of incorporation. In Florida, these are easy to download right off the state website. In my case, I have a corporation, so bylaws, company must have bylaws. Minutes, so we create a board of directors, Every year we have an annual meeting of the shareholders. The shareholders elect the directors elect the officers hire the employees and are responsible for the day-to-day operation. Share certificates, right? It's funny, I mean, this piece of paper is a symbol of property. I mean, this is an asset. So these are the things that we call the corporate formalities. Now, one of the risks of LLCs is that everything I just listed, which is mandatory for a corporation, is optional for an LLC. So it's very easy. My associate Elizabeth likes to call them Sunbiz cowboys. People who figured out the simple, hey, I don't even need LegalZoom. I'll just go on Sunbiz and I can create my own company with $125. Well, then I ask them, when's the last time you had a board meeting? And they're like, what board? And when's the last time you had an annual meeting? And I'm like, annual meetings? You know, where do you keep your corporate records? What corporate records? You know, obviously it gets to the point where they're not following any of the formalities, okay? Now, what's the significance of that? If you're gonna get the protection of a business, you gotta run it like a business. It's that simple. I remember my law school professor taught it to us that way. You gotta treat it like a business in order to get this imaginary line. Because what we wanna have happen is we want, and obviously this is a worst case scenario, but we wanna have the terrible thing happened here, they filed the lawsuit, didn't have enough insurance, they got the judgment, and then the lawyer, or whoever it is trying to pierce the corporate veil, and I want it to bounce off, like an imaginary force field. I want it to go there, and I want the attorney defending Bob to say to the judge, Your Honor, there was no fraud. Bob kept good records and had separate bank accounts. He never used his company credit card for personal, and for that matter, he never used his personal credit card for company. He kept his work life and his personal life separate, and he followed formalities. He kept a corporate book. Once a year, his lawyer prepared some written minutes for him to sign and file away, hopefully never to think about again. But that's the point. He followed all the rules, and they should not be allowed to pierce the corporate veil. Bounces right off. Obviously, this is a complex subject, but for a 10-minute primer on it, this is what I explain to most of my clients. And in fact, you know, if we want to get a little fancier, we can add another layer. Maybe we have a holding LLC right here. And maybe we put that holding LLC in another state, like maybe Delaware or Nevada, or maybe even a foreign country. But just remember, U.S. citizenship, residence, and substantial presence test tax residents who have ownership of foreign companies have to report it to the IRS. So don't forget that. And also report foreign bank accounts. But Bob is now here. So now we've got another level of limited liability. So lawsuit goes there. They have to prove whatever they need to prove to pierce the corporate veil. If somehow they're successful, which would be really bad, because if they're successful in piercing the veil here and now the judgment's at this point, then we lose everything again. All right, so we have still lost the war, so to speak, all this. But then they would have to pierce the veil a second time in order to get to Bob. And who knows, Bob might have other assets, he might have other savings, he might have other investments that he truly wants to keep separate from this little real estate scheme he's got going on. So that is, I guess, a crash course on piercing the corporate veil. All I can say is I discourage all of the Sunbiz cowboys out there and all the accountants, you know who you are, who are creating companies and maybe even drafting operating agreements. That's called unauthorized practice of law. Every business owner should have an accountant, an insurance agent, and a lawyer that they can consider a friend and just pick up the phone and be able to run these questions by. So I'm Eric Rodebois, EPGD Business Law. This has been fun, and we'll see you next week, hopefully on Wednesday.